Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. A special thank you to Dr. Tom George for being here and presenting to us today on his findings. So everyone give a nice welcome to our visitor. Is this enough lighting?
I think so. Yeah, I think this will be good. So thanks, Veronica, and thank you all for coming, because I know if you're here, you know, you're interested in history, and it's a beautiful, Saturday morning, so thanks for keeping the flame of history alive here in Kankakee. And I also want to thank Jory for coming, and you will see she played a role in helping me untangle the story that you're going to hear today. And before I start, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself, and like why would I, from out of state, be telling you about Kankakee, and how this came about. So I'm originally from Flint, Michigan, but I settled in Kalamazoo, and I'm an anesthesiologist. I'm a physician. I went to medical school, so I went there to work. I've been there almost 40 years. But I became interested in local history, in Kalamazoo, not being from there. And we have historical markers and such, so I was learning about that. And that is how I stumbled on this connection to Kankakee. It was through just being interested in local history. And then kind of through that, and how one thing leads to another, I became interested in the community, became involved in the community, and I served as a state representative from Kalamazoo County, and then the state senator for Kalamazoo County in the Michigan legislature. And we have a wonderful thing in Michigan called term limits. And so I've been out of that for 10 years. My time ended. You could serve 2 terms in the Michigan Senate. My time ended, and I went back to my medical practice. And that's when I picked up, my research. And eventually, during the pandemic, when the operating rooms were shut down or closed down partially, I had some extra free time, and I finished writing up these studies. And so they've been published. What I'm going to tell you has been published, and you can find it. I will email Veronica the links later, but they've been published in the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association. So, they're in Springfield, and they have an ongoing journal. They publish twice a year. So this material can mostly be found there if you question something or you need to see the details. So that's a little bit about my background. So let's get started here. Okay, good. So yeah, I moved to Kalamazoo, and here we have a historical marker in Kalamazoo, and it turns out that Abraham Lincoln came to Michigan once in his life. So you take him for granted, because he was all over Illinois. He was only in Michigan once, and it was to Kalamazoo. So I became fascinated by this, and I started collecting, primary sources related to his visit. And, we're going to talk about 3 things, basically. We're going to talk about how his Kalamazoo visit links to Kankakee. Then we're going to talk about how that led to finding how Kankakee links to Lincoln's U.S. Senate aspirations. And then we're going to talk about how Kankakee links to an 1859 financial scandal that Lincoln wasn't involved in, but that he helped control after it occurred. So those are the 3 takeaways we're going to talk about. And just a little review, and you all know this, being Illinoisans, but when he comes to visit Kalamazoo, it's 1856. He's not yet president, right? 1856. He'll debate Stephen Douglas in 1858, so he hasn't even done that yet. And you'll recall that he had served in the Illinois legislature, 1 term in Congress, and then had begun practicing law full-time. And you'll know that he practiced law in the circuit court in central Illinois. So Kankakee was not part of Lincoln's usual circuit, but he did that for, I think 17 years-ish. And then in 1854, he became interested in politics again and was drawn into politics again. And what happened in 1854 was the Kansas-Nebraska Act that said that new territories would choose for themselves whether they would be slave or free. Right? Prior to that time, with the Missouri Compromise, slave states were in the South, free states were in the North, but your Senator Stephen Douglas worked with the legislature to pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing new territories to choose for themselves. And Lincoln and others argued that that opened the door potentially for slavery to move to the north, because Kansas and Nebraska, their statehoods were pending, and if they chose to be slave states, slavery would go to the north. So this drew together the anti-slavery components that were in two different political parties at the time, the Whigs, Lincoln's party, the Democrats, Stephen Douglas's party. Slavery was an issue that wasn't fixed in either party. There were pro and anti-slavery people in both parties, but when this happened, the anti-slavery people started to coalesce. And in Michigan, that led to the formation of the first statewide Republican Party in July of 1854. So anti-slavery activists said, we don't want slavery to move north, we're going to get together and oppose that. They formed a Republican Party in Michigan in 1854. Yours would come 2 years later in 1856. But as time passed, more states had these Republican parties. There was a presidential election coming in 1856. So what do? They have a national convention to pick their candidate. So there was a convention in Philadelphia in June of 1856. Illinois sent delegates, Michigan sent delegates, other states in the north that had Republican parties sent delegates, and they picked John Fremont as their presidential candidate. So this is 4 years before Lincoln will run. They picked Fremont. His running mate was William Dayton, and you may know that the Illinois delegation suggested Lincoln for the vice presidential spot, but he finished second in the voting to Dayton. Lincoln was not at the convention, it was the delegates who were doing this on his behalf. So the convention ended, and the delegates returned to their home states. One of the Michigan delegates, was a man from Kalamazoo, Hezekiah Wells. So he comes back to Kalamazoo. He's enthused about the ticket, the new Republican Party. We've got a candidate, Fremont. And he sets about organizing a large campaign rally on Fremont's behalf. A large rally on Fremont's behalf. And he will invite Lincoln to come and speak at the rally. So this is the genesis of Lincoln's only trip to Michigan. He's coming to this rally. He's invited by Wells. If we look at the primary sources, we'll see he came in by train from Chicago. He spoke at the rally. He stayed overnight. He went home. He never returned to Michigan. And the text of the speech was found many years later because a reporter had taken it down using the shorthand of the day. And it was printed in a paper that went out of business, but a researcher found it later. So those are some of the basics of his visit. There are some primary sources related to this rally in Kalamazoo. Here's one from the Jackson, Michigan paper. 30,000 people showed up, according to this paper. Now, Kalamazoo is only a village of 10,000, so maybe they're exaggerating a little, but if we look at the accounts of the day, most of them talk about the size of the crowd and the food. A couple of them mention Lincoln. There he is there. They're mentioned in the attendees, Honorable A. Lincoln. So he's mentioned in a couple of the papers. Here are a couple from Schoolcraft. It's a village near Kalamazoo. Henry and Hattie Parker Smith. He was a farmer and he kept a diary. And here's what he said about the rally in his diary. He talks about the food, and he talks about how there were tables spread with all kinds of food, and every few rods were set barrels of ice water with tin cups attached. I commenced at one end of a table and ate my way through. I ate my way through. T-H-R-E-W, and you underlined it. I ate my way through. So again, the focus is on the size of the crowd, the rallies, etc. Here's the gentleman that discovered the text of Lincoln's speech, an amateur historian, found this paper years later, and he published it in a booklet. And if you bought a book of Lincoln's speeches, there are a lot of famous ones, you might see the Kalamazoo speech in there. You might or you might not. But it was recovered in the 1930s. Okay, so that's the basics. But why did he bother to go to Kalamazoo? If we look at his travels, we'll see that year, that's the only time he left Illinois. The whole year. He only left Illinois once because he's busy, traveling the circuit. He doesn't have any reason to come to Kalamazoo. And the year before, he left Illinois once to go to Cincinnati. A year later, he left once to go to Niagara Falls. So this is kind of exceptional that he would make this special trip. He's got no connections that we know of to Kalamazoo. And in fact, he turned down other invitations during the same time period to speak at least in 2 other out-of-state meetings. He turned them down. Here was one in Iowa, and here from the governor in Iowa. The new Republican governor invited him to come. And here's one in Indiana. And yet, they came to the one in Kalamazoo. That's even farther away. And if we look at his writings, and by the way, this is an excellent primary source for all students of Lincoln. In the 1950s, researchers collected all of Lincoln's known writings, collected or reviewed them, visited libraries and museums to review them, and they transcribed them. If they were in, longhand, they transcribed them and they published them in a 12-volume series. 12 volumes. But now they're online and it's a searchable database. And there've been a couple supplements published. But if we look at and it's his writings, these are things he wrote, not things people wrote to him, things he wrote. If we look in there, we can see his letter turning down the invitation to go to Iowa from the governor. And he says, I'm too busy. I can't spare the time. And then he says, when you bring in people from out of state, it stirs up more enemies than friends. So he has an excuse, and he turns down the governor in Iowa. So again, why would he come to Kalamazoo? Well, if we consult the collected works, we will find a letter Lincoln wrote responding to the gentleman that invited him. And it's a very curious letter that we're going to look at. Remember, he's invited by Hezekiah Wells. This gentleman from Kalamazoo had gone to the convention, and Wells has invited him. We don't have the invitation, but we have Lincoln's response. So it's in the collected works, and we're going to look at it carefully here. And Lincoln writes, yours of the 24th, July 24th, inviting me to be present at the Fremont Mass meeting to be held on the 27th in Kalamazoo. It has been forwarded to me by Mr. Meacham of Kankakee. It would afford me great pleasure to be with you, and I will do so if possible. And notice, I don't know if you can see it here, there's a footnote next to Meacham. Did Lincoln put a footnote in his letter? No, that's from the editors. The editors put in a footnote, and they often did this when there was a person, and then the footnote would explain, like, who is this person? So again, here's the line in question. There's the footnote. And we can read the footnote. And it's in the book. In fact, I'm going to pass it around. The marker here brings you to the right page, if you care to look at it. But it's what you have on the screen. And the footnote says, Lincoln's spelling of this name may have been Machin, M-A-C-H-I-N. The 2 E's have been written in over Lincoln's letters by another hand. Written in by another hand, like somebody else scribbled over it. Neither name, neither Meacham nor Machin, has led to an identification of the person involved. So the editors are saying, we don't really know who this is. We think it's a Mr. Meacham of Kankakee. So me, being a good researcher as I was, I wrote to the Kankakee Historical Museum and your Historical Society. I did this probably in the 1990s, and I said, who is this Mr. Meacham? And I got a letter back like, we don't know who that is. There is no Mr. Meacham. So time passed. And it turns out this actual letter that we're talking about, it's in the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. We have a museum much like yours. They have this letter because the Wells family donated it at one point. So they have the letter. It's not on display usually, but I had a chance to look at it, and here it is. And we're going to focus in on the part in question. Here it is. Here's Lincoln's writing. Your letter has been forwarded to me by Mr. Meacham of Kankakee. Now, look at a couple things here. Here's what they're talking about, the writing over. It's this darker ink here. But if you look carefully, there's something very curious. Here is a comma. See? Comma. Lincoln put a comma. Now look how he uses, like most people use a comma. Here's a comma. Comma, space. Comma, space. Comma, space. Here, the space has been filled in by this doodling. This really, when I looked at it, I think is only a 4-letter word. It's not Meacham, 6 letters. These have been added in, and the editors misread that as being a 6-letter word. It's a 4-letter word. So if we take that out, and maybe we take out some of this extra scribble, we get this. Mr. sort of looks like Mack, M-O-C-H, of Kalamazoo. But I will tell you, this is a K. We can look later and we'll see that's how Lincoln made his Ks. And this is an A. This is a Mr. Mack of Kankakee. So, time had passed between me seeing this and then seeing the letter. And I'm thinking, that's kind of weird. I should write back to the Kankakee Museum and see if they know who Mr. Mack is. So I wrote, and Jory answered me. And she said, well, Mr. Mack, he was one of our first village presidents. He was an important person here in Kankakee. So that led me to come, to the museum to find out a little bit about Mr. Mack. And Jory sent me, or I found, eventually, his obituary. And here's one from the New York Daily Tribune. He must have been fairly important. It's in the New York paper. He died in 1871. And here is the interesting thing. Mr. Mack died in Chicago. He was born in Vermont, and while a lad, penetrated the extreme verge of civilization, settling in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Wait, I thought he was from Kankakee. There he acquired the science and afterwards the practice of medicine. He was a doctor in Kalamazoo. He remained there and then moved to Kankakee. So he was in Kalamazoo, then moved to Kankakee and became one of your early village presidents. So there's a connection between Mack being in Kalamazoo and then Kankakee. Here's another obituary. Oh, this is from your paper. And it basically gives the same thing. He was born in Vermont, went to Kalamazoo County, came to Kankakee, died in Chicago, etc. And so I'm thinking, wow, he was in Kalamazoo too. So I checked my local sources. What did he do in Kalamazoo? And here's our county history. And here's a section on the professions, the early doctors. Dr. Mack and Bowles. This was written in 1880. Both dead. Were each of them among us. Dr. Mack, removing to Kankakee, became wealthy, politically prominent, and died there. So it's the same person. He was in Kalamazoo, then he moved to Kankakee. And here's another interesting connection. This is a list of township officers in a village near Kalamazoo called Schoolcraft. And if we look on that list, we will see Alonzo Mack served as the township clerk. So before he was your village president, he was the clerk in 1848 in Schoolcraft. And Hezekiah Wells, the guy that invited Lincoln to the rally, he was the treasurer in Schoolcraft Township. So they knew each other. They served on the same township board. They knew each other. So now we can kind of piece the story together a little bit here. Oh, and here's Mack's address when he was in Kalamazoo. So we can piece it together. Here, Mack, born in Vermont, served in office in Schoolcraft, then he moved away, got married, moved to Kankakee, worked here he changed his profession to a banker, according to the census, became president of the village, and then he was a delegate to the same convention in June of 1856. So he and Hezekiah Wells were both delegates. They would have, worked together here on the township. They saw each other at the convention. This explains why Hezekiah Wells could give the invitation to Lincoln to Alonzo Mack, his buddy, now the village president of Kankakee. So we've explained that connection. But so what? Why does that make a difference? Who gives him the invitation? He already turned down the invitation from the governor of Iowa. Why would it make a difference? Good job figuring out that it's not Meacham, that it's Mack, but why does that make a difference to Lincoln? Why could that possibly motivate him to travel all the way to Kalamazoo? So it just raises, like history does, it raises another question. But we can answer that. And the answer is it has to do with Lincoln's aspiration at the time. He is not running for president yet. He's running for the U.S. Senate. In 1858, he's going to debate Stephen Douglas. He's going to be a candidate for the Senate. But most people have forgotten that he had also run for the Senate in 1854. He ran for the U.S. Senate twice. And the important thing to know is who? Who elects the U.S. senators then? Is it us? Is it you, the people? The people? No! It's your state legislators. It was the state legislators that picked the U.S. senators. And at that time, we had 75 state representatives and 25 senators under that Constitution you were operating under. There were 100 people who picked the U.S. senators. Only 100. And so, we can understand the connection here when we consider that this visit to Kalamazoo falls right between Lincoln's two runs for the U.S. Senate, and that is his goal. And if we look at that 1854 contest, the previous one, we're going to see something very interesting. Recall I said the Republican Party had not yet formed in Illinois. So we had Whig Party, we had Democrat Party, we had abolitionist, KN is a know-nothing, V is a vacant space, and we had, among the Democrats, anti-Nebraska Democrats. These are Democrats who were against slavery. So the Republican Party hadn't yet formed in Illinois. You had a fragmented legislature that had been elected in 1854, and they were going to pick the next U.S. senator. It wasn't against Stephen Douglas. He was midterm. The other U.S. senator from Illinois at the time was James Shields. So his term was up. There was going to be an opening, and this new combination of legislators was going to pick the next U.S. senator, and Lincoln wanted that to be him. And he reasoned that if the Whigs voted for him, and he could get the anti-slavery, the anti-Nebraska Democrats to vote for him, he could win. He could win. So how does that campaign take place? They're elected in 1854. They're going to be sworn in January of 1855. Then they'll meet and pick the new U.S. senator. How does that campaign take place? It's not speeches. It's not rallies. It's letters. It's the emails of the day. It's personal communication and letters. And we can monitor the campaign by looking at Lincoln's writings and the collected works. We can see what he wrote to legislators, and we can look in the National Archives and see the letters written to him. Many of them ended up in the Library of Congress. We can look there and see letters written to him, and we can follow the campaign by looking at the correspondence. And Lincoln is aided by his colleagues from his law practice and the people that he knows from the 8th Judicial District Court. And here are some of the letters to him. Here's a whole bunch of letters to him, all written after the election. So the new legislators are elected, they're not yet sworn in, but these are the target for getting the votes. And Lincoln is writing to them, he's writing to his friends, he's having his friends contact them, and there's some very interesting things we see. Here's a letter, and I'm going to just read part of it. And some of these have been transcribed by the Library of Congress, some of them haven't. And you have to pick through it yourself. But look at this. This is David Davis, who you know Lincoln would later appoint to the Supreme Court. He's a friend of Lincoln's. And he's writing to Lincoln. Swett is another of their friends, Leonard Swett. He thinks he can do something with Strunk and Parks of Will, and with the members from Kendall. He says Strunk is a Whig. He talked with Strunk about you before the election. Strunk was favorable. Who's Strunk? Strunk was your state representative. He was the state representative from Kankakee. So he features prominently in the correspondence. Lincoln is trying to determine, will this guy from Kankakee vote for me? Remember, his law practice is in central Illinois. Northern Illinois is kind of new territory for him. You would think it would be more anti-slavery, right? Being in the north, that would be a fertile ground, that he would have, get a good response there. But he needs to reach out to those legislators. And so, here's another one. And this one is really my favorite. It's very difficult to read. It's written to Lincoln. It's written from Joliet. And it is written by James McDougall, and I'll tell you who he is in a minute. My wife had to help me decipher this. It's very difficult to read, but I'm just gonna give you the highlights. James McDougall is the postmaster in Joliet. He's the postmaster, and he's writing to Lincoln. your letter to Mr. Goodell is past received. What's he talking about? The post office received letters and people had to go pick them up. They didn't necessarily deliver them to your house. You had to go pick it up. The letter is in the post office for Mr. Goodell. Your letter to him is past received. Mr. Goodell is in New York and Washington. He won't return soon. So I opened the letter. I opened the letter because it said, let this be confidential on the outside. So I thought it was important. I'm the post. I opened the letter. And now that I've seen it, I'm going to take the responsibility and answer your questions. And what were those questions about? We don't have Lincoln's letter. We don't have the Lincoln letter. We only have this response. What were they about? Mr. Strunk of Kankakee. And what does Mr. McDougal say? Mr. Strunk has always been a strong Whig, and always will be. He's a man of strong prejudices and choleric nature. He goes by Honest John. I think you should better write him. So again, what I'm trying to show is there's back and forth between Lincoln and his helpers. And here, the postmaster of Joliet steps in to help. And here's a little summary of all these letters. We don't have to go through all of them, but there's several letters that mention Mr. Strunk of Kankakee. Davis says he thinks he can do something with Strunk. McDougal, you had better write him. Norton says, I think you'd better write him. Sweat says, I met with him. He's in favor of you. Davis says, Sweat has met with him. He's in favor. Pay him his expense money. Sweat, his traveling money. So who is this Mr. Strunk? He's the Whig representative from Kankakee. As the campaign is coming to an end, the new legislators are going to be sworn in. They're going to vote in January. Lincoln writes to Congressman Elihu Washburn, tell Norton that Mr. Strunk came out for me, which I thank him. Lincoln thinks he's got Strunk's vote. So what happens on February 8th when they go to vote? You may know the story. There's 10 ballots to pick the new U.S. Senator. James Shields is not running again. Lincoln gets the most votes on the first ballot. I think he has 45 or 47. But on the 10th ballot, it's clear that he's going to lose, and he directs his supporters to vote for Lyman Trumbull, who will win. But who does Mr. Strunk vote for? And this is to prevent a surprise candidate, Joel Madison, the governor, a Democrat, suddenly became a candidate midway through the voting. It's to prevent him from winning. But it turns out of all the Whigs in Lincoln's own party, John Strunk of Kankakee was the only one to cross party lines and vote for Madison. So think about that for a minute. We just went through, the election of the speaker, Kevin McCarthy, and there were like 14 votes, and it took a long time to figure out who the speaker was. I don't think there are any Democrats that ever voted for him, or any Republicans that voted for a Democrat, during that. So think how unusual this was, that a member of Lincoln's own party jumped over and voted for the Democrat candidate. So do you think Lincoln noticed? Oh, here's the Democratic candidate, Joel Madison. He was the governor again. But why did Strunk do this? Well, Lincoln analyzes this in a letter. We can look at the collected works. And he wrote this to Congressman Washburn. It was Governor Madison's work. All the members, he's talking about the legislative members, around the canal were friends of his. One notable instance was Mr. Strunk of Kankakee. At the beginning, he told me he would walk 100 miles to elect me. But no, leaked out that he was going for me and then switching to Governor Madison. So, these votes are public. They're printed. Lincoln was in the gallery. He saw this happen. There's the canal. We're talking about the members around the canal. What canal are we talking about? The I&M Canal. There's the canal. Why would the members around the canal not support Lincoln? Remember, they're in the North. You'd think, oh, they're anti-slavery. They should support him. Well, there was a lot of canal politics. Lincoln, you'll know, had supported the building of the canal. But after the canal was built, some of the local citizens were not happy because it changed water levels. Maybe they had their land taken. They had grievances over the building of the canal. And they sued the canal. And the canal appointed a commission to hear the claims. And Lincoln was on the Canal Claims Commission, and they denied some of the claims they allowed, some they denied. So this might be why there was some friction between Lincoln and the Canal area legislators. In fact, one of the Canal area legislators, State Senator Uri Osgood, introduced a bill to pay all the claims, And Lincoln was hired by the Canal Board to testify in the legislature against it. So he had to come out, and this had been years earlier, come out against paying claims to people around the canal. So this might explain why some of the area legislators, weren't so happy with him. Maybe. The other interesting thing, remember that letter he wrote that the postmaster answered? It was to Mr. Goodell. Like, who's this Mr. Goodell? Well, it turns out Mr. Goodell had been the clerk of the Canal Claims Commission. He lived in Joliet. That's how Lincoln knew him. He was the clerk. So they were probably friends, they worked together on this commission for a few years. So Lincoln had written to him, can you help tell me about these legislators? He's out of town. The postmaster answers, but it turns out Mr. Goodell, in the interim, had married Governor Madison's daughter. So he is the son-in-law of Lincoln's opponent. He probably unwittingly wrote to his opponent's son-in-law, and he's saying, help me get the vote of the X, Y, and Z. And it's possible, we don't know, it's possible that Mr. Goodell, he eventually got that letter, and he would have shared it maybe with his father-in-law. They had this intelligence, Lincoln's trying to get their votes, we better do something, we better get those votes. So we don't know. That's speculation. And then there were some allegations that Governor Madison, and we may come back to this later if we have time, that he may have bribed some of the legislators to vote for him. Just an allegation, hard to know for sure, but there was some evidence of that. So in the end, Lincoln had lost that 1855 Senate vote. So 1856, he's invited to Kalamazoo. He's running for the Senate again. And what happens in the interim? John Strunk, his nemesis from Kankakee, who had voted against him. Remember, he was choleric? He died of cholera just a few months after the vote. Mr. Strunk, your representative, died. And there's going to be a new state representative from Kankakee. By the way, I found Mr. Strunk's grave yesterday. It's in Moment Cemetery. And there it is. He died in 1855. So he's the one Lincoln's talking about who voted against him. So now, Lincoln is running again, for the U.S. Senate. He was only a few votes short. And he needs the vote of that next state representative from Kankakee. He knows where he fell short in the votes, right? He knows where. And Kankakee is one of the areas that he needs to pick up. And Alonzo Mack, your village president, is running for that seat and will be the next state representative. He had been one of the delegates, remember, to the National Convention, and he's going to run for the legislature. Lincoln is going to want his support. So when he says to Lincoln, I've got this invitation from these people I know in Kalamazoo, will you go to their meeting? No, we don't have this conversation, but I'm thinking Lincoln is, well, I might do that. Did you know I'm running for the Senate again? And I could use your help. Well, if you go to, so it's, we don't have the direct evidence, but it's really the best explanation for why Lincoln would leave Illinois, make a 4-day visit, 2 days to get to Kalamazoo, then 2 days to come back. It's the best explanation for why he would do that when he's turning down other visits. He's doing a favor for your village president, your next state representative, Alonzo Mack, because he wants him to vote for him in that next Senate race. So why? Why did Lincoln come to Kalamazoo? He came to Kalamazoo because of politics. Because of Illinois politics, your politics. That's what brought him to Kalamazoo. So we've touched on two of the things that I want to talk about. We've got one other subject. I'm just going to skip ahead here to be mindful of time. Here is, by the way, in the election of 1858, we should mention this. So Alonzo Mack did run. He became your state representative. Lincoln was monitoring the vote, tabulating who was winning, and here's how he wrote Mack in the 1858 tabulation of the legislative winners. It looks like very similar, to what we saw earlier. So he won Mack's vote, but guess what? The Republicans were in the minority in both the Illinois House and the Senate. So despite all that, Stephen Douglas was reelected, right? You know that, Stephen Douglas was reelected. So he did all this work trying to get these votes from future legislators, and it wasn't enough. He fell a few votes short. So when I was doing this work, I asked Jory, do you have a picture of Mr. Mack? And she said, no, I don't think we do in the museum, but you should check at City Hall. And I'm thinking, someday I'm going to want a picture of him. And so I called City Hall, and they said, well, we have a picture of all the mayors and the village presidents. It's on a wall in City Hall. And I'm like, oh, good. Will somebody, I'm in Kalamazoo, can somebody take a picture and send it to me? No, we don't do that. Well, can I come down and get a, oh sure, you can come down and get a picture, but don't come on Fridays, because we're not open on Fridays. So Mrs. George and I came to Kankakee, this is about 10 years ago, we come to Kankakee, and there's the mayoral gallery. And I'm thinking, he's got to be one of these first ones here, he's going to be on the wall. Oh, no photograph. So I have no picture. So your duty, you know, Kankakee Historical Society, if you can find a picture of Alonzo Mack sometime, that would be awesome, because I have no picture of Alonzo Mack. I did find him, though. He's buried in your limestone cemetery. Okay, he's buried there. He died in Chicago, was buried here. So we've touched on, you know, Lincoln's visit to Kalamazoo, why Kankakee is related, and how that's a factor in his Senate aspirations. Next, we're going to talk about an 1859 financial scandal that Alonzo Mack was involved in. And this will complete the story. Are we okay so far? Are you with me? Any questions about what we've covered so far? How are we doing on time?
Great.
Okay. All right. So the new legislature meets in 1859. They vote, you know, for the U.S. Senator. They pick Stephen Douglas. But just a few weeks after that, so Lincoln lost the second time for the U.S. Senate. He's returning to his law practice. He's lost twice. But people are talking about him maybe as a presidential candidate, you know, maybe because he did such a good job with the debates with Douglas, etc. So maybe. But in the meantime, shortly after, just a few days or a week or so after that vote, the state auditor, Jesse DuBois, reports a potential fraud that he has discovered to the legislature. He reports that canal scrip may have been illegally redeemed. And the Senate convenes an investigation to review this allegation. So I have to tell you a little bit about what we're talking about, and then you'll see how it's going to connect to Kankakee. So, of course, it links to the canal. And canal scrip was a way the state used to pay workers who were working to dig the canal when the state got into financial trouble and they ran out of money. They ran out of money. They had borrowed money and they couldn't borrow anymore and they ran out. So they paid the workers with an IOU. We call that scrip, S-C-R-I-P. And here is an example of it. You can buy some on eBay if you want, you know, just as a collector's item. Here's a canal scrip. This one's for $100. And they would write in the person's name, who was going to receive it. They were signed by the secretary, by the Canal Commission. It's dated, they're numbered. But notice the fine print. So you get this. What do I do with it? Well, it's $100, which the Canal Commissioners promise to pay you when the funds are available. When the funds are provided for that. So you can't take it to the bank today. You can take it to the bank when the money, if you take it to the bank today, the bank's going to give the money's not there. But maybe, hopefully, sometime in the future. So they paid the workers with IOUs. And let's just finish that for a sec. So they did that, and it turns out that this was in the 1830s. In early 1840s, while the canal was being dug. So it happened years earlier. And they kept a roster, a log, you know, of who had received scrip. It was numbered. And most of the recipients did redeem them. And within a couple years, most of it had been redeemed. If you were a worker and you got paid in scrip, you could sell it to somebody as a discount. Somebody might give you, you know, $50 for a $100 scrip. There was a market. People were buying and trading scrip, speculating. Oh, I don't know, you think it'll ever be worth anything? I'll give you a few bucks for it, we'll see. So there was a market on scrip. But eventually the state made good and they paid off almost all of it. So what happened, what the auditor reported was, years later now, in 1859, he's checking the books and he sees that the state has just paid off a bunch of scrip again. But no, it was all paid off a decade earlier. And then he looks, and bundles and bundles of it had been paid off during the from 1854 through 1859, and they had been paid to Governor Madison, the Democratic governor who had briefly run for the U.S. Senate, whose son-in-law was Roswell Goodell, who Lincoln had written to. But the governor had redeemed this scrip. And so there's an investigation. And by the way, the governor had redeemed, he was a very wealthy millionaire. He had built over this time the largest home in Springfield, 3 stories with 17 bedrooms, larger than the governor's mansion, and he moved over there when he left the governor's office. The hearings took place in the Supreme Court room in the state capitol. So the Senate's investigating this. They're investigating these bundles of scrip that the previous governor has been turning in. And they take testimony. And they take testimony from the clerk at the bank, and he's like, this scrip looked like it had been already redeemed, like it had already been canceled. But the governor brought it in. What am I supposed to do? You know, so the bank had paid it out, even though it already appeared to be canceled. Testimony also showed that what happened was when the scrip had been originally redeemed, a decade earlier, the redeemed scrip had gone to the canal office, maybe in Ottawa or Lockport, for storage. It had been in a trunk. And when Governor Madison took office, he appointed a new canal commissioner who contacted him and said, I found this trunk with all this, what do you want me to do with this redeemed scrip? And the governor said, send it to me for safekeeping. So the canal commissioner testified that, yeah, I gave all this to the governor, 10 years ago. So the governor was redeeming this. Not only was he redeeming canceled scrip, but in there was mint scrip that had never been paid out. They printed extra. It was a book that had never been used. And somebody, probably him, had filled in, names and taken that in and cashed that in. So they had mint scrip that didn't match the register. It had been going on for years, and it was hundreds of thousands of dollars. So what happened? Well, the former governor, sat in on the hearings. And he did not testify, but he submitted a letter explaining what happened. And his explanation is this. He bought that unused, or the mint scrip, he bought it from a dealer. And he bought it over a period of time. He doesn't remember who he bought it from. He doesn't remember who he purchased it, but he purchased it. He's a speculator, and like others, he purchased this innocently, not realizing it had already been redeemed, not realizing it had already been canceled, notwithstanding the fact that he had been, while he was in the legislature, he had been chairman of the finance committee. He knew well, how these things worked. But he said, yeah, I bought this, I didn't realize it had already been canceled. I took it to the bank and they paid me. I don't know. So he portrayed it as an honest mistake, and he offered to pay the state back its calculated losses. And the Democratic legislature approved that plan. They approved that plan. They voted to accept the repayment plan. He had 5 years to pay it back. Well, so the legislature finished its work, and they would only meet for a couple months in those days. It wasn't year-round. So they finished their work, and they were discharged. But some Republicans, the Republican officers, the auditor, the Secretary of State, others, felt that the governor had gotten away. He'd gotten away with stealing. So they wrote a letter to the grand jury in Sangamon County and recommended that the grand jury investigate. So they turned it over, for prosecution. In those days, the grand jury would meet, they would review the evidence, decide if a crime had occurred, and then they would turn it over to a prosecutor. So a grand jury reviewed the case against Madison. They had hearings. They brought in the same witnesses. They had the same letter from the governor. And they had, I forget exactly how many people on the grand jury, but they voted to indict him. They voted to charge him. And then they recessed. And several of the members apparently went to his mansion and then returned. And they reconvened and they voted again. And they did this 4 times. And each time, there was one less vote to convict him. And finally, they voted not to indict him, and then they adjourned. But the foreman of the jury, his name was William Butler, he was in favor of indicting Madison, and he caused the grand jury records to be printed. Normally they're sealed, they're not public, but he had the records printed and they were serialized in the Illinois papers. So when I'm telling you the record for this, it's available because the grand jury's work was printed in the paper. And the Republicans said, a great injustice has been done. He got away with stealing from the people of Illinois. The Democrats said, no, the state has been saved a great trial. He's going to pay them back. He's going to pay us back. The jury did the right thing. So these are the two opposing views at the time. So that's kind of the way it ended. But just while this was being printed, while it was being serialized in the Illinois paper, while the grand jury proceedings were being printed, there's a report of another financial scandal that appears in the paper. And this one involves not the former Democratic governor, this one involves Republicans. Another fraud printed in the Chicago Times, and this has to do with another redemption of canal bonds called McAllister-Stebbins bonds. There's the canal. McAllister-Stebbins bonds, there's the state ledger for these. And this allegation was that the current Republican governor had approved redeeming these bonds at an inflated value. And I'll explain briefly. These were special bonds that had also been sold when the state was bankrupt. They were to pay interest on previous bonds, and they were marked $1,000. They would be sold to investors in New York for $1,000, and they were going to pay 6% interest. But when the investors went to buy them, they're like, we're not going to pay $1,000 because we don't think they're going to ever be paid back. So they could only be sold for $250, more or less. So they sold them for $250, though they said $1,000. So then later, the bondholders came in to have them redeemed, and they said, we want our $1,000. And the state legislature looked at it and they passed a bill, this is in the 1840s, saying, no, we're only going to pay you what you paid plus interest. So the bonds were devalued to $250 plus interest. And like the canal strip, most of the bonds were redeemed at that, and some were outstanding. Now, here we are, 10 years later, the Republican governor says, I'm going to redeem those at full value, And this is what becomes the second scandal, the McAllister-Stebbins bond fraud. The governor, the Republican governor, says, I'm going to pay these off at the full value, $1,000. And who is behind that? Well, if we look at an oral history of Abraham Lincoln, taken later by John Nicolay, who was one of Lincoln's secretaries and biographers, he interviewed Ozias Hatch, who was the Secretary of State, and he said, in reference to this, the holders of the bonds, in connivance with a Republican of prominence, induced the state to issue new bonds. Mack was at the bottom of this affair. Mack, like Alonzo Mack? It says he went to New York. He exchanged the bonds and came back to Springfield and told me. So could this be the same Alonzo Mack? Well, if we look at that book, there's a footnote, and it says that Mack is presumably Charles McAllister by the editor, who is Michael Burlingame, who's a famous, Lincoln scholar. But he's wrong. It's not Charles McAllister. That's just the name of the bank that sold them. It is Alonzo Mack who's behind this. And how do we know? Because he wrote the Chicago Daily Journal, and he said so himself. He explains, when there's word of the scandal, he explains that no, they bought the bonds legally. And I'm just helping them get their fair share back. And here it is. See, he wrote the letter. There it is, Alonzo Mack. He explains the history of these bonds. Remember, he's a banker now in Kankakee. Maybe he has some himself. We don't know. But he says, no. I'm going to help them redeem it. And he was appointed by Governor Bissell to make this transaction. But then, when the whistle's blown on it, he has second thoughts. And Matt goes on to say that, on subsequent examination, the governor came to the conclusion, that they're entitled to their full amount. But then, Looking at a more careful examination, the governor became doubtful of his authority and telegraphed to stop refunding these bonds. So Mack is saying, yeah, I helped do this, it was the right thing to do, but on second thought, we're not going to do it. No single dollar has been paid to the bondholders. We changed our mind. And in fact, he sends a telegram to the Chicago press. All the bonds issued for the McAllister-Stebbins bonds will be surrendered without loss to the state. So it's your state representative, Alonzo Mack. He's on the banking committee. Apparently, he has worked with the governor to induce him to do this, but now they're having second thoughts, and they're saying, we're not going to. So, what does this have to do with Lincoln? Well, Lincoln learns of this. He learns of this in July, and he sends the state treasurer in the same day. He sends the state treasurer a telegram and a letter, both in the same day, a telegram and a letter. And the telegram says this. It's to the treasurer, and I like the way he addresses this, at some hotel, New York. For your life and reputation, pay nothing on the new McAllister-Stebbins bonds. A. Lincoln, and signed by his previous law partner, Stephen Logan. So Lincoln inserts himself. He does like, don't let this happen. Don't pay this out. And the treasurer, James Miller, writes back to Lincoln. And he says, I understood from Dr. Mack and Jesse's the state auditor, that all heads of messes were agreed, that everyone's agreed that we should pay these bonds out. This quibbling is contemptible and annoying to me as a treasurer. Come on, get your stuff together. Lincoln said, yeah, don't do that. And so here's an article from the Joliet Signal about your state representative and about this event. And it says, the people have little confidence in Alonzo Mack. He's been engaged in the shaving business, and I think they're talking about banking, shaving deals and banking. It is said he made the boast on receiving his appointment to the Finance Committee that he meant to make money out of it. Such is the man who Republicans choose to look over our finances. So the Democratic press is going after him, but the Republican press defends him. Here's from the Chicago Journal. Remember, he was a doctor, Dr. Mack. The recollection of the surgical operations he performed upon the corrupt Democrats is still in their memory and is too soon to be forgotten. So they're debating, back and forth. In the meantime, the Senate Investigating Committee, the same one that was looking at the script bonds that had been returned improperly, is now looking at the McAllister-Stebbins bonds, and they report that yes, these were exchanged illegally. They were exchanged illegally, despite Mack saying that no, they weren't, and telegraphing back that they weren't. And so now the Democratic press really goes after him, and they say this was a planned swindle. There was a perfect understanding between the Republican state officers. The exact amount of money to be received by the Governor Bissell, the auditor, the treasurer, and Representative Mack can only be surmised. So the Democrats are accusing them of planning this all along. The Democrats are saying, by the way, Governor Bissell knows all about these bonds, how they work. He didn't misunderstand the law. It was a planned swindle. The Republicans say the governor is ill. He was ill. And people are preying upon his afflicted condition. And that, no, the new bonds have not been surrendered, but we will not recognize them. We're not going to pay any money out. And finally, the treasurer writes to Lincoln again, and he says, I'm going to resign, and I want Dr. Mack to take my place as the new Illinois treasurer. He comes highly recommended by some of our officers. I hope you will review the matter and let us have the light of your countenance. You may know Orville Hickman Browning, who was a prominent later U.S. senator. He keeps a diary, and he says in his diary, Mack, your Alonzo Mack, he's in no sense fit for the office of treasurer. It would be fatal to the Republican Party if he's appointed because he's involved in this scandal. Ward Lemon, Mr. Lincoln's friend, says, I doubt very much the propriety of appointing Mr. Mack. So why are they telling Lincoln about appointing Mack? Lincoln's not the governor. He doesn't appoint people because the governor, Governor Bissell, is ill. and they think Lincoln is making the decisions behind the scene. The treasurer does resign over the scandal. Here's his resignation letter. It's in your state archives. And he resigns, and William Butler is named the replacement, not Alonzo Mack. And who was William Butler? He was Lincoln's friend, and he was the foreman of the jury, the grand jury for the canal strip investigation. So he's appointed the new state treasurer. So the Democrats continue to attack the governor. Lincoln, meanwhile, now he's out, thinking about being president. He goes to New York. He's giving speeches. And they're attacking Bissell, but he dies in office in the spring of 1860. He was ill, like Lincoln said, and maybe they did, prey upon his afflicted condition. The governor passes away. Lincoln and Herndon, their law office, handles the governor's estate, and the issue basically comes to an end. And the Senate Finance Committee later confirms that no money has been exchanged with the McAllister-Stebbins fiasco. It was a proposal to exchange them at their higher value, but it didn't actually happen because the press brought it to light, and Lincoln said to the treasurer, "Don't do this." And the treasurer finally resigned. So the Republicans averted a scandal because Lincoln stepped in. There are some interesting repercussions to it. One is that in that same spring of 1860, when Lincoln does get nominated for president, there's also now a race to determine who the Republican candidate will be for governor. Governor Bissell's dead, his term was ending, but now Republicans need to pick a new candidate. There are three, and we don't need to go into great detail, but the scandal plays in to the politics between these three, and in the end, the convention chooses Yates as the candidate. He's a congressman and has nothing to do with either of the scandals. Norman Judd, a state senator from Chicago, is accused of being in league with Madison in the canal strip scandal, and Leonard Swett had promoted Mack to be the new treasurer when Miller resigned, and so he's accused of being in league with him. And the third candidate, Yates, wins and becomes your governor and will be governor during the first part of the Civil War. So the scandal has a repercussion within Republican politics. Lincoln, of course, gets nominated that same spring. Later, when Lincoln is president, a banker from New York meets with him about the McAllister-Stebbins bonds. They still have them. They say $1,000 at the top. They were devalued to $250 with interest. He meets with Lincoln while Lincoln's president. And Lincoln writes to the state, at that time, the state auditor, and he says, "Can you help, resolve this?" And the legislature said, "Okay, we'll allow them to redeem them, but it's still the $250 plus interest." So then they're all redeemed, and that ended it. But there were some repercussions in Illinois law. You may know that you drafted a new state constitution a few years later, and in that, your constitution forbid any further funding for railroads and canals after these two financial issues. So the scandal shaped the background while Lincoln was seeking the Republican nomination. The record is somewhat confusing, because the primary sources are difficult to read. The Madison Mansion eventually burned down, so many of his papers were lost. And there's been confusion over the identity of Mack. Some people called him Meacham, some McAllister, but no, he is Alonzo Mack, your former state representative who was involved in all of these things. He was an integral figure in early Republican politics and may have been partly responsible for this scandal, which had the potential to damage Illinois Republicans and Lincoln's political aspirations. And we will stop there. Thank you for your attention. And I hope it just shows you that your community played a role in the events of the day leading to Lincoln's rise to power and the coming of the Civil War. Thank you.